Hi, greetings. It's me, Dr. Paul Gerhardt, and thank you so much for taking time to watch this video. This video is about organizational environment and culture, and I know we're talking about change, but I wanted to lay down a solid foundation for you and give you some basic terms and ideas to consider, including a change model that's in place to help leaders really consider what to consider in organizational change and always be focusing their time and energies on. So let's get started. First of all, we have to be aware of open systems. These are things that are affected by and that affect their external environment. So in a business, organizations are always doing things where there are stakeholders involved, where they have to always consider what they do and what happens as an impact with what they're doing. And also, leaders need to be considering the inputs. You know, if they're going to make organizational change, they have to be aware of there are outside sources that the organization is reliant upon. And so being aware that that can affect organizational change. And then the outputs. Those really are the products and services that the organizations create. And of course, no organization can stay in business unless they are putting out outputs that are desirable to consumers, where people are finding value in that, and so that's obviously where the revenue is generated. So open systems, inputs and outputs are kind of the foundational idea about what leaders really need to be looking at for big picture as they're considering organizational change. Well, the external environment really is anything outside of your organization's boundaries that really have an effect. And there's a lot of different things. You know, if you think about laws and policies that could affect the organization, you know, consumer perspectives on things that are related to what your organization produces. And so we have to consider the microenvironment, you know, how the government, economic conditions, and other fundamental factors that affect the way that the organization runs. So leaders can't just do business as usual anymore. We're in a global marketplace, so there's so many factors that leaders have to be considering, including the competitive environment. And so in that competitive environment, when we're talking about that, we're including suppliers, customers, rivals, you know, anything that really will affect the way that the organization does business. They have to be considered. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the model from Harvard is Porter's 5 forces. And so essentially, Porter suggests that suppliers could have an effect on the way that you do business. You know, if you have a lot of different suppliers available, obviously you've got more ways to be able to bring down the costs of doing business because you can negotiate. Well, I know your competitor produces this too. So sometimes when there's a limited number of suppliers that produce a product, then the costs of your producing your product, if that product goes into yours, can go up. And so that's something that can affect, because price is one of the factors that affects whether or not people will consider your product or service. You know, the impact of new competitors entering the market. I can remember a quick story about an owner of a Burger King knew that a new McDonald's was going to be opening up just up the street. And so one of the ways that it tried to negate that is on the opening day of that, when that Burger King, the competitor, opened up, and I don't know if those are the names of the restaurants, but the owner on opening day of the competitor closed the store, put a sign up on the door that says, "In honor of our new competitor, we are going to be closed. Please visit our new competitor at," here's this address. And what happened is all the regular patrons of that restaurant went to go see the new competition, and the new competition ran out of meat, and the lines were too long for them to handle. And as a result, customers got fed up right off the bat, and that restaurant ended up closing. So it kind of is a creative way, and maybe you might debate an unethical way, but it was just a way that a leader had decided to compete with an upcoming competitor because he or she knew that it would have an impact on its overall sales. So customers have a lot to say. As a matter of fact, I believe all organizations must have some system in place to measure the satisfaction of customers all the time. What are the needs and wants and desires of your current customer? What are some potential related needs of customers? And so being always aware that customer satisfaction will dictate future sales and revenues, right? So, and then the impact of substitute complementary services and products. So you have to be aware of who your competitors are. You're a coffee company, and outside you know that the weather was really bad, and so all of the crops of coffee got destroyed, for instance. And so people probably will stop buying coffee at the same rate if you're a coffee company, if you have to raise your prices because costs go up because your supplies are lower. And so tea may be something that people buy, and so you have to be aware of either you get into the tea business or recognize that your customers may be going to the nearest tea shops. So it's kind of a weak example, but you guys get the point. So you always have to be aware of also that of the existing rivals in the industry. They are constantly looking for ways to change to stay competitive. And that's the very nature of being in a global marketplace, is all organizations really must be aware of these factors that can affect organizational change. If you're not feeling those out, you could be just like other companies like Kmart who go bankrupt because they're not constantly changing the way they do business to the needs of their customers and to the other forces that affect the way they do business. So you have to be aware of the things that will always be changing. And so some of these terms that we think about are environmental uncertainty. Really not having enough information to know what we don't know. And being aware of how complex the environment is and the degree in which everything is interconnected. You have to be aware of, if you're in a business that's providing, a product that's grown naturally, the weather could happen, and that can affect the costs. Or maybe a political shift can change the laws of the way things are done. So you always have to be aware of how those are all interconnected and have a contingency plan in place. Your plans in place to help make sure that you're constantly staying competitive. And so we consider that the environmental dynamism. And so some markets don't change as much in other markets. So you have to be aware, really, really know the market that you're in and the factors that affect your market. We do this through a process called environmental scanning. That's about really staying aware of things using different various types of information. You have to maintain competitive intelligence. You have to be looking at what your competitors are doing in benchmarking. Are we doing this as well as other people? Where are we getting our competitive edge or a competitive advantage, and how are we leveraging that competitive advantage using the benchmarks to our competitors? Leaders need to do forecasting and scenario development. If this happens, we'll do this. So you have to be able to look at best case and worst case scenarios and have a plan in place to make sure that you're making the necessary adjustments, because once a competitor gains a competitive advantage, it may be too late to earn your lost customers back, right? So we do things as leaders like make decisions, and we adapt at the boundaries. Sometimes we'll grab a lot of a product that goes into our product or services in order to help buffer We think the weather's going to be really bad this year, so we're going to buy an extra 2 tons of this product and then just warehouse it so we don't run out and it doesn't drive our costs up too high. And then smoothings are really about making the necessary adjustments when we recognize that our costs are too high or other factors are maybe leveling out, and we need to level out in order to maintain expenses. And then make sure that we're having the right strategies in place in order to maintain our current market share. So as a leader, there are a lot of different ways to influence the environment. We hear about people who are lobbying all the time or creating commercials that help make people feel a certain way. Sometimes it's about taking competitive direct action. I can remember when Coke wanted to compete more with Pepsi, and they did or Pepsi wanted to compete better with Coke, and so they did the Pepsi challenge, and I think that kind of was a flop, but it really kind of got people thinking about the differences between the two products and getting people to taste the two products. Doing public relation things and voluntary action things and taking legal action to get a better competitive stance or political action. So there's a lot of different things that leaders have got to be thinking about as they create their change. Cooperative action is really important. So sometimes leaders find ways to work with other organizations, and they can do that through contracts, co-optation, and coalitions. Really being aware of other creative ways to join forces with other organizations to either lower costs or get into a new market. These are ways that leaders can look at change a little bit. So being very, very aware of the industry that they're in and sometimes diversifying. I can't imagine like Starbucks getting into the motor oil business. But it looks like Starbucks probably, as a beverage company, could do their own brand of beer. Maybe they have done their own brand of beer. So really being able to take a look at maybe complementary products. They're a food company, and so I suspect maybe they might have their own line of soups, for instance, Starbucks soups. That might actually work. So being aware of the domain that you're in and different ways of diversifying can help you maintain market share. I think the example of Kodak, they didn't jump in fast enough. They had the corner store on the photograph business, and then digital cameras came around and it changed everything. I don't think they did a good enough job transitioning and embracing technology. Sometimes leaders have to think about mergers, combining with another company. What does our organizational structure look like? What kind of existing systems are in place that we need to consider to change? Are we replicating these things? What about our organizational culture and our policies? Acquisitions are the same kind of philosophy. When a company buys another company, you have to take into consideration what changes are going to be made. Warren Buffett very often buys companies and then he leaves all the existing structures in place and trusts the people that are in place. And that's been a good winning formula for Warren Buffett. And then divestiture is about selling one or more businesses. Sometimes companies get a little top-heavy, like the Gibson Guitar Company bought some digital sound recording companies, and they're realizing they just didn't know enough about that market, and so they're trying to sell off that share of the business to avoid bankruptcy, for instance. So changing the boundaries in the environment means you've got to be a prospector, being aware of what new products and markets and mergers could possibly take back, and then you have to be a defender. Make sure that you are in a stable marketplace and that you've got the right change actions in place at the right time. So here's 3 criteria to help you with the best approach. You need to change what can be changed. You should use the appropriate responses, and then you should choose responses that offer the most benefit at the lower cost. So costs are always a consideration. Organizational culture probably is the biggest thing that you need to consider. And there are things called visible artifacts that companies do, you know, the way that people dress, the way that the office looks, organizational charts, you know, symbols, you know, heroes. Values are a really big thing, you know. Sometimes companies do things like, let's become a green company, and they jump on the bandwagon of, you know, it just feels good to be a part of us. And then the unconscious assumptions, you know, that we have to be profitable. And so we have to be aware of a lot of the different things that organizations do. I think Zappos is a really good example of a company that leverages their company culture. You know, they hire for fit. They put out what their organizational values are, and they offer people, you know, tests to see if they're a good fit with their organizational values. And then on a regular basis, they have interviews with people to see how they're still a fit, you know, on a scale from 1 to 10 with each of their organizational values. And so sometimes they even pay people to, if they get hired, they give them the choice between staying with the company or leaving, and we'll give you $3,000 if you leave, you know, to help you take the next step. So there's a lot of different things that organizations do to make sure that they have a strong organizational culture that supports products and services production, maintains a competitive environment. So a strong competitive environment helps create stronger trust with the organization. You know, it's easier to make change with a strong culture. A weak culture, people work in silos. People are holding their knowledge and resources tightly. So you want to have a strong organizational culture. And of course, the leader and the policies that go in place always have to be considered. Competing with cultures, there's like 4 different basic models that should be considered. You might pause this slide and take a look at this for a second. I don't want to read all these different things, but you know, you've got to be able to make the right changes in culture that's right for the way that you compete, and it's right for the way with the people that are involved. So anyway, I wanted to keep this video relatively short, but thank you so much for your valuable time. I appreciate it. I hope that you have a great day, because only you get to choose how you feel about it. I'm Dr. Paul Gerhardt.